Thank you for staying with us. Nigeria is often called the giant of Africa and the most populous nation. Despite its economic and demographic weight, Nigeria is still grappling with inadequate access to electricity. According to reports, over 90 million Nigerians lack access to electricity. Some other reports claim Nigeria loses an estimated $29 billion annually due to power shortages as enterprises and households expend huge sums on diesel, petrol generators, and other stopgap measures. Experts believe addressing Nigeria's electricity crisis requires a multifaceted approach, including increased investment in power generation, infrastructure, modernization, and the promotion of renewable energy sources. Joining us from the United States of America is an energy lawyer and partner at Bloomfield Law Practice, Ayodele Oni. Good morning. It's good to have you join us.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, let's begin with the matter of how we got to this point, especially where we seemingly can no longer handle the matters of electricity subsidies. At this point, we see Nigeria, or the federal government, is having an outstanding debt exceeding 4 trillion naira. And the Minister for Power is saying that if Nigerians want electricity, they have to pay for it. How did it get to this point? Because successive governments have been able to manage the subsidies, but here we are, seeming like we can no longer carry this burden.
Okay, so it's many factors coming together over time. You had subsidies, and prior to this time, even when we started to have a multi-year tariff order around 2007, 2008, when we started to have a multi-year tariff order, the idea was the idea of sculpting. Prices were supposed to be low because people, power was seen as a social good. So such that you either didn't want to pay or you wanted to pay something very minimal. It was so bad that when we had NEPA, the cost was lower than the price per unit was lower than the cost per unit of producing gas. And recall, over 80% of power generated is thermal and is gas fired, you know. So historically, prices were low. When we had NERC around 2005, 2006, when we started to then consider moving to the private sector and improving the sector, tariffs became slightly higher, but were still not cost reflective. The idea was to sculpt, to have lower tariffs over a period of time and then have much higher tariffs to recover the losses. And, you know, and with time, by 2020, government then began to talk about particularly service-based tariff system and all of those, and cost-reflective tariffs. So there were increases, right? And people found that a bit difficult psychologically too, because prices were historically low. And gas prices can continue to go up. Our currency continued to devalue. And it meant that you wanted the private sector to come invest. No private sector person is going to come invest when your cost of production is lower than your sale price. You know, so government got to a point where we had trillions in debt. Recall also that because it's gas fired, many of the generation companies, as they're called, could not pay for gas. And over a period of time, we had a legacy debt of I think 1.9 trillion thereabout, you know. So historically, if tariffs were low, were not cost reflective, it meant you couldn't pay for your costs, which included the cost of gas, which was quite substantial. So it kept continuing to balloon, and government continued to grapple and struggle with offsetting some of these subsidies. And we got to a point where incomes didn't increase substantially and costs continued to go up, and then we got to this point where government could no longer handle it. I think that's what's been historically.
Yes, and I guess that in a bid to solve this problem that you just explained, they came up with the band A, B, C, and D, which says the band that pays more has better service and so on. However, what concerns me is that in Nigeria, we are focusing more on hydro and thermal only? We have other sources of generating power because, I mean, basic economics says if supply is more than demand, the prices will go down, you know. So why are we not exploring other avenues of generating power?
Okay, so there are technical there are technical issues, there are financial and historical issues. Now, you will say that we've concentrated on gas because we've got in huge quantities. So if you, economics of scale, if you got benefit and the capex, initial capital outlay of a gas-fired plant of the same size compared to, say, solar or any of those other renewables is much lower. You know. So because that's much lower, there's been concentration. That's one. Two, we also forget the technical issue around even the grid. There are issues around whether the grid can take different load types. You know, we continue to assume there are issues around the gross lack of protection and control schemes, you know, for the grid. So such that it's difficult to even take that mix. That's another point that I think we miss. So people are beginning to look at distributed generation, which is off-grid, and the Rural Electrification Agency has been doing that for a while. But one thing we need to take into consideration is our share numbers. So that mix, we're beginning, and NERC is that rules around the quantity schools must take a percentage, you know, of their overall power offtake. So the rules are there, the policies are there, but if you look at countries like the US, it's not that straightforward when it comes to renewables. You must be prepared. And what the strategy in Nigeria has been off-grid. So it's not completely true that we're doing nothing about renewables, but because historically gas-fired plants have been cheap and we have gas in large volumes, it would naturally be the case that we will gravitate towards that. There's more now around renewables, but we need to think through an overall policy. You know, it's not just to do things haphazardly. What's the percentage you want to do for renewables? And as subnationals also take over, there's need to have those conversations with those subnationals and understand what's best for them. You know, it's energy federalism as far as I'm concerned, such that if you have coal, particularly if you think clean coal technology does work, then use your coal. Just ensure that you have a strong mix. So I think that those have been in the works. But remember 2016 when the government initialed, I think, 14 utility scale IPP power purchase agreements. Part of the challenge was the refits, renewable energy feed-in tariffs. The feed-in tariffs were a challenge. They said it was amongst the highest in the world, and the government didn't go ahead with those projects. So it's not that straightforward. It's a combination of many things. Can we afford the capital outlay? Can the grid take that mix? And I think grid may struggle. And then the strategy has always been off-grid. If you go to a lot of rural areas, you see a number of projects done by the Rural Electrification Agency. At some point, markets, Sabon Gari, there's that market, I think it's Alaka in Lagos, and a number of those. Whether they've then sustained that is a different conversation. But I think that from an energy mix point of view, it's something that is ongoing.
Exactly, but we said something in the beginning and I want to take us back to that. We say that if people want electricity, they should pay for it. But trust me, even this electricity that they are paying for in the band A, we don't even see light like that. Now, Nigerians don't even have the resources to even pay. And even when they decide to pay, there is no light. What is the step in the right direction for this?
The one thing I think we need to take very seriously in this part of the world is data. One credible way to ensure that you properly, everyone is accountable is metering. And you may be aware of the meter acquisition fund managed by NERC. First thing we need to do is to properly meter. Because understand that certain band A consumers haven't even been adequately metered. That's one challenge. So question is, what data is NERC seeing? Is NERC seeing that everyone in band A does get a minimum of 20 hours? I know I've heard varied stories. Some say they get as much as 20 hours and think they can't even afford it. Some say it doesn't even work. They are band A, but there are local issues beyond the feeders that frustrate their efforts. So the question is, and we need to ask NERC, what are the findings with respect to band A? Is it that 90 or 95% of those in band A get 20 hours? That's one of the conversations. Another conversation you want to have, and really when you speak to energy issues, in countries like the UK, even in the US, you win or lose elections because of energy issues, right? Those conversations, and I believe we'll get there, particularly from the nationals, as states take over the electricity markets. I believe we'll start having conversations around whether you succeeded with the power sector and whether you deserve a second term or whether you deserve to even win an election in the first place. So we can't speak about energy without looking at the broader economy or the economic realities. Naira down.
Mr. Oni, if you could just hold your thought for a bit, we need to quickly go on a break. When we return, we'll continue this conversation with you. Do stay with us. All right, thank you for staying with us. Before we went on the break, we were speaking with Ayodele Oni, energy lawyer and partner at Bloomfield Law Practice, on developments around the power sector. And quickly now, you spoke about the matters of infrastructure, but as Nigerians are perhaps looking forward to an increase in tariff, how will that bring about perhaps efficiency and delivery and perhaps upscaling the infrastructure we have right now? Because the average Nigerian just wants power to work with in their homes.
Okay, so two things. I'm not completely sure I agree that the average Nigerian just wants power. It must make sense in terms of pricing, and data must play a role. It's not just to have power and the prices are ridiculous. I think they must be reasonably priced. One, you want to also be sure that the guys in band A have the numbers of hours promised, a minimum of 20 hours, right? And then you begin to talk about issues such as sensitization so that people know how to be energy efficient. You know, government does have a role in ensuring, particularly NERC, sensitization and all of that. That said, now, if tariffs are cost reflective, it's likely to attract more investment. Two things: proper metering, because what's the key challenge in the sector is the aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses. If you want to nab those in the board, it then means that you need to ensure that investors can't come. And investors only come if they are sure they can recover their costs and make a margin. So prices, yes, need to go up. Query is whether they need to go up now and the percentage in which they need to go up. And then I think in that regard, to answer those questions, we need to go back to data and find out historically where we are. With band A, did everyone get that benefit under band A? And what are those local issues outside of the initial arrangement, leading to challenges for band A users such that they are then not benefiting? Then how does this cascade to states? I think those are conversations that need to be had. Prices will go up or should go up. Query is whether it's now and percentage, in my view. And infrastructure will then improve if you can have more investments, private sector investments in particular, because government can't do that all by itself.
Right. We can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about renewables, we can talk about everything. It's one thing for us to have this power supply. It's another thing for us to pay for it. And if you look at the power sector, it's been jinxed by unpaid debts, that it is now run up to 4 trillion naira, which the federal government is saying that, okay, listen, we are going to pay half of it and others, through promissory notes. But the question there is that, how do you think this accumulation of debts has affected the power sector, and what is it that we've not gotten right? And the other leg is, what strategies do you think that can be implemented to ensure that people pay and will reduce the debt burden on this sector?
Okay, one critical thing, and last question first. One critical thing to ensure that people pay is to adequately meter and to have a mechanism that tracks, using technology. If you have a mechanism that tracks that, typically for an area such as this or for this particular compound. You typically do 300, 400,000 a month, and then you find out that that drops. So stuff like SCADA, technology generally should play a role, and proper metering. That's the most efficient way to do it. And I understand that in 2024, I think around June, NEC did order DisCos to use the first tranche of disbursement of the MAF, Meter Acquisition Fund, to buy meters or to provide metering for bank customers. So I think that's critical if we can properly meter. And then NEC needs to continue to track. It does have a quarterly report. I was reading the last quarter report, I think for last year, and there was a lot of information and the improvement in efficiency and collection by the DisCos just for that quarter. However, it's many things coming together. Proper metering, does pricing work, ensuring we are more efficient, and improving even other bands, right? So that it's not just that they remain, particularly band C, D, and E. You know, we need to ensure that it continues to expand that improvement, and it doesn't just stay with band A whilst tariffs go up. If tariffs go up, then service quality also needs to improve. So it needs to be a measure of positives to the government and positives for us. Now, to ensure that we do not go back to such debts, tariffs need to be cost reflective, and you need to ensure that there's more discipline by the DisCos. NEC does excellently well when it comes to issuing orders, regulations. Enforcement is an area where they may need to do more. I mean, I did see, or I did hear about penalties to a number of DisCos because of the banding arrangement and their failures, and they were supposed to refund monies to consumers. If we begin to see this more and more, you will see more market discipline. That's the key thing. Market discipline is critical for the DisCos. Right tariffs, but ensuring that it's not just tariffing, because that shouldn't be the only solution. Otherwise, you'd lose people. If I'm spending half of my income on energy, then it becomes a major challenge for me, right? It becomes half to 3/4 of my income, because those prices are electricity prices or monthly costs is now quite high. So I then also think that government must also look at the broader economy, right? Productivity and all of that need to improve, because if people need to spend more on energy, there must be a source of income, and then government needs to do more around sensitization on energy efficiency, people using solar, and maybe even arrangements where people can pay in installments for solar to support current grid power. I think that mix and a combination of those factors will continue to play a critical role. And the grid, a lot is being done with the grid, especially with an independent system operator now, which separates transmission service provision and system operation. And
yes, let's look at this other angle. You said metering is the most effective way of collecting data concerning power supply and all that. We have a company in Akwa Ibom State that produces meters. That means it's locally produced. So I'm wondering, why are we still having issues with 100% metering of the whole of Nigeria? That's one side. The second side, Mr. President recently just said 122 billion US dollars will be the figure they are looking at for investments in the power sector. And that takes me to the infrastructure that we have in the power sector in Nigeria. They are old. I mean, we don't need to use any flowery word to say that. They are old and they need changing. They need changing. And according to you, that's one of the reasons why Nigeria has not really explored other sources of generating power. How do you see this investment they are talking about? 122 billion in the next 25 years or thereabout, and the fact that we have a factory that produces meters right here in Nigeria, and we are still having problems metering the whole country.
Okay, so thank you very much. The metering challenge isn't something that happened today. We've historically challenge. That's one. Secondly, the cost. Not many people can afford to pay upfront for meters, and the volumes or the share number makes it even difficult for distribution companies. That's why the idea of a meter, we've had the meter asset map, we've had the national metering policy, we have the meter asset meter acquisition fund, so it shows that it's not necessarily cheap. I think the last time I bought a meter, it was over 300,000. Not many people can afford that in a month, so it's made it difficult for anyone to just go to the market and buy, or even for the discos to buy. Even if you have local producers, a number of those components will not be sourced locally. So it requires forex. It requires an initial capital outlay, and it may be difficult for them to sell on credit. So at times it's not about local production alone. It's the cost of that local production and the ultimate selling price. So I think it's a combination of those historical challenges, the cost, and in some cases, people have said marketing discipline by the discos. Some discos feel that, and that's the argument. Some discos feel that if you meter, then you can't do estimate and you can't determine what your revenue will be. I hear it's so bizarre that in some areas, discos just say, "Oh, we want to make $1 billion from this area," and just split that bill. But if you have metering, it may well be that if people can manage their energy use, then their own cost to substantially reduce. So it's a potpourri of issues.
Yeah. What about the federal government's proposed investments in the electricity sector of $122 billion in, I think, 25 years thereabout?
I think it's about 21 years. I think it's a projection, and it's because of the integrated power policy, which was approved by the president and I think it's the council. So I think it's projections, it's aspirational. And recall that what that policy seeks to do is to ensure a coordinated development across subnationals and the federation. So if it's well implemented, we will see substantial investment over that period of time. Could even be more than that. But where the cookie typically crumbles in this part of the world is implementation. So if that policy is well implemented, if subnationals can ensure that there's no political interference in the power sector for their states, ensure that they can attract investment, people do pay, there's proper metering, and people get efficient service, then you will begin to have that sort of investment over 2 decades in the power sector. So I think it's a reasonable projection and a reasonable ask, provided, of course, implementation isn't the problem, and political interference isn't the case with the subnationals in particular.
Ayodele Oni, energy lawyer and partner at Bloomfield Law Practice. Thank you so much for your time on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Great. All right, we will be taking a break now.